All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Forward CloudSec 2024. In our session this morning, to kick us off, will be Knerr. She'll be speaking on I'm Doing My Part by mapping cloud incidents to attack techniques. This session is brought to us by Permiso, one of our gold sponsors. Permiso is a threat detection company that finds evil in cloud-based environments. Detection in identity, cloud, and SaaS environments has suffered too long from a one-size-fits-all SIEM approach. Modern environments require a purpose-built platform. Permiso uses human and non-human identity attribution to pair runtime and static data in cloud and SaaS into complete sessions where detections no longer have to rely on single events and no context. Permiso's platform provides high fidelity, high resiliency, and maximum context for actionable detections. Thank you, Permiso. And over to you, Casey.
All right, citizens. The cloud is under threat from nefarious actors looking to make their way into your environments. What we need is a map, a way to leverage our knowledge, our intelligence, and our resources in order to better understand the threats that we face, to bolster our defenses, and to lift each other up. We all need to do our part. I'm Knerr. I am a cybersecurity engineer at MITRE, and right now I'm the enterprise lead for MITRE ATT&CK, which is a publicly available knowledge base of adversary behaviors. If you met me at Forward CloudSec last year, you may have known me as the Attack for Cloud lead, and while my purview has expanded slightly, there will always be a very special place in my heart for cloud. Don't tell the other platforms. But this is about all of us and what we can do together. And right here, right now, everybody maps and nobody quits, even when things get hard. We'll start with an obligatory 50,000 feet explanation of what attack is. It's, as I mentioned, a knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques, cataloging things that threat actors are doing in the wild when they're targeting systems and networks and cloud environments. It's free, it's publicly accessible, it's community-driven, and it's grounded in publicly available threat reporting. Attack tries to function as a common language to allow us to talk about these malicious actions in a standardized way, so we're all operating on the same page. Tactics represent the why, the broad goals of the adversary when they're performing actions, things like initial access and establishing persistence. Techniques represent the how, what the adversary is actually doing in order to achieve their goals. Things like sending phishing emails or manipulating accounts. And by bringing these things together, we can start to, again, talk about these behaviors in a sort of standardized fashion. Attack Cloud is the above, but the cloud parts of it. So it's not just one platform, it's a few different platforms. Infrastructure as a service, software as a service, Google Workspace, Office 365, and Azure AD. We realize this is a little bit messy, especially because it's now Entra ID, but we're actually working on it. Before I get started with the how, I wanted to introduce the why. Why take a perfectly good threat report and try to extract technique IDs from it, for example? Mapping to attack lets you leverage this common language that I was talking about. Lets you receive and share threat intelligence, working with the community. Lets you identify trends in adversary behavior and find gaps in your defenses. Maybe you cover initial access really well, but you're really missing out on detections for persistence, for example. It allows you to take some of the awesome threat reports written by many of the folks here and have one more tool in order to use those for your own defenses. And I like puzzles. I like taking things and putting them into nice little boxes, bringing them in order. I think it's fun. Maybe you do too. There are 3 riddles that you need to answer in order to map a technique. The first is, what is the behavior being described? You're looking at these threat reports and you've got to pick out from these long passages and paragraphs and bullet points what you actually care about. So what these actors are actually doing in sort of small atomic units, and then understand that behavior. If it's an API call, what does it do? If it's a permission or a role, what privileges does it grant? If it's a service, what's that service for? This part, you all are cloud security experts. You can do this. You know how to understand these behaviors. You know how to research them. The second part is where things can get a little fiddly, and that's figuring out what goal the actor is trying to achieve. You're trying to find the tactic here to help narrow down the list of techniques. And why this is tricky in the cloud is because often tactics can be closely intertwined. Things like persistence and privilege escalation, things like collection and exfiltration, it can be a little bit difficult to separate one from the other. And some tactics like lateral movement or command and control are a little bit strange in the cloud. So some of this is just going through and understanding what these tactics are. Luckily, if you do the first two parts right, the third part is relatively straightforward. And that's just going through the techniques and finding which one maps best onto this behavior that you now understand really well. And from there, narrowing it down to a sub-technique. So you're finding the behavior, you're finding the goal, and then you're finding the method, the technique. Tips here, read the descriptions. They contain a lot of detail that the titles do not. Leverage the search. If you have API calls or services or terms of art or permissions, you can search for those. They might be in the descriptions. They might help you identify what you're looking for. And finally, it's not always one kind of sentence to one technique. Sometimes multiple techniques may be relevant here, may be closely intertwined. Like phishing, sending a malicious file, might rely on user execution, getting a user to open that file. And finally, I know I said I like putting things into neat boxes, but the world doesn't always work that way, and especially the cloud. So it's good to acknowledge that sometimes things can get confusing and embrace the chaos, get feedback from other people, and just enjoy the process. It's okay if it's not 100% perfect. Now, the main thing I've heard as a complaint about mapping in the cloud is that you're going through and you're looking at your threat reports and you're saying, all right, this sounds like valid accounts, cloud accounts. And then you go through and you see valid accounts, cloud accounts, and then over and over and over again until the heat death of the universe. Some of this is on us. Some of this is that there's simply not as much public threat reporting in cloud environments as we want, and things aren't added into attack until there's evidence of adversary abuse. But we have other techniques, we promise. There are many tools in your arsenal for defending the cloud. So I wanted to give some examples of how I would think about mapping cloud threat reports to specific techniques, starting with APT 29. And specifically, a really great Microsoft threat intelligence report on a recent intrusion. So we're starting with a long paragraph here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the general summary is Midnight Blizzard is using password spraying attacks. They compromised a test tenant account that wasn't using MFA. The paragraph goes on to define what a password spray attack is, and then notes that the actor tailored their attacks to a limited number of accounts and a low number of attempts, trying to evade detection here. So the first step is we've got to pick out what are the behaviors here? What is kind of the small unit in all of these words? And the important bit is that this whole paragraph is about a password spray attack. And we don't have to do too much research on what that is because Microsoft helpfully tells us. A password spray attack is when adversaries are trying to sign into a lot of accounts with a small number of passwords. So we have our behavior and we understand what it is, and now we have to find the tactic. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because if you were building a sort of kill chain, then you might put this in initial access. And that's totally fine, but for attack, we're thinking about this a little bit differently. So tactics aren't necessarily ordered. They could happen at different stages of the intrusion lifecycle. So here, we're thinking about password spray attacks not just as a method of gaining initial access, because they might not always be successful in that sense. Maybe MFA is enabled, or there are conditional access policies that block the access, but they could still succeed in getting passwords. So the key point here is the goal is to obtain account passwords. And this lines up pretty well with credential access as a tactic. But from there, as I mentioned, it gets relatively straightforward to find the specific technique and sub-technique we're looking for. We're thinking about how the adversary is trying to sign into many accounts with a small handful of passwords. Signing into many accounts sounds like brute force, and using a small handful of passwords sounds like password spraying. This is very convenient because it's the exact same term that Microsoft used, and the descriptions are almost verbatim. So you might have been able to find this with a search, but I wanted to show you that the system works. Our next example is Scattered Spider, and this is from a great Permiso report, Scattered Spider Getting Sassy in the Cloud. We have another long paragraph here. They talk about how Scattered Spider is performing reconnaissance. They're navigating around the AWS management console, looking at services like billing, understanding these services, navigating to them. And then they also want to know what packages are running on these EC2 instances. So they're using AWS Systems Manager. They're running a job to find the software that's running here. So again, we need to pick out the behavior. There's a few things that are interesting us. And specifically, we want to know about the AWS Management Console and returning the software running on EC2 instances. There's kind of two major points made in this paragraph. So our goal here is pretty clear. We're doing these things to enumerate services and software in the victim environment. Permiso calls this reconnaissance. Totally fine. The attack word is just discovery, but it's all of the same thing. The adversary is trying to figure out and understand what's going on in this environment. Now, there's two techniques we're trying to get at. The first is using the AWS Management Console. This is using the user interface, the GUI, as opposed to, say, the command line interface or another method of interfacing with the cloud. And so we're looking at Cloud Service Dashboard, using the Cloud Service Dashboard GUI to gain useful information from an operational cloud environment. The second bit is a little bit interesting because it demonstrates a way in which the cloud platforms, like infrastructure as a service, may bleed a little bit into the other platforms, like Windows or Linux, depending on what these hosted instances are running. So that's a consideration too when you're mapping and trying to defend in the cloud, is there might be some movement back and forth between these platforms. And here, we're looking at software discovery. Permiso said very clearly they're trying to get a list of the software installed on these systems, and that's what this technique is about. Last example, shorter paragraph. Organizations store credentials in AWS Secrets Manager or Terraform Vault. Scattered Spider's leveraging Cloud Shell to scrape credentials available in these solutions. So it's pretty clear, it's a shorter paragraph, what we care about, the scraping of credentials. But there's also an important bit here in that Cloud Shell is being leveraged. So we're interested in potentially these two closely aligned techniques, like I mentioned earlier, which are not just scraping from Secrets Manager, but also using Cloud Shell. And when we think about Cloud Shell, we're thinking about execution, a way of executing commands in the cloud environment. So slightly different goal here, but still kind of similar process to get there. For method, we're thinking about executing AWS API commands via Cloud Shell. We're thinking about command and scripting interpreter then, and Cloud API. And Cloud API is another one of those slightly dangerous techniques that could end up mapping to basically everything like cloud accounts, but I wanted to call it out specifically here because of the mention of Cloud Shell. The second goal here is obtaining credentials. That's what Secrets Manager and these other solutions are for, storing credentials. So by going after them, we're trying to get access to those credentials. So we have credential access again, but now it's at a slightly different stage of the life cycle of the intrusion than the earlier example. That was closer to the beginning. This is closer to the middle. And the method here, stealing credentials from AWS Secrets Manager. And again, it's important now understanding what Secrets Manager does and is for, because you might be tempted maybe to think about something like unsecured credentials. But you also know these credentials aren't unsecured in the sense that Secrets Manager is designed as a place to store credentials. So we're thinking more about it as a common password storage location, credentials from password stores. And then moving on to the sub-technique, Cloud Secrets Management Stores, which again calls out AWS Secrets Manager specifically, so you might have been able to find this one by searching. So now what? You've got your list of techniques, and what do you do? And you might be saying, this is hard. And sure, it's a little bit fiddly, but it definitely gets easier over time as you start to understand the tactics and techniques. You all already have the cloud expertise, you know this inside and out, so it's just about learning to leverage that language. And it really doesn't have to be 100% perfect, and there isn't 100% perfect. We're not teachers, this isn't a test, and even if you go through a report and you're not sure about one or two things, you'll still hopefully get some actionable objectives out of it. Now, that part about getting actionable objectives is really important, because if you just kind of dust off your hands and say, well, that's it, save it to a file, and never look at it again, you won't really have done much that's useful. So it's important to start to leverage that information. So go through the techniques, find common mitigations and data sources, low-hanging fruit and easy wins that you could start implementing and collecting in order to actually bolster your defenses. And then you can test those. And then map more reports, share the information, get feedback from the community, use each other, on and on in a cycle. So, would you like to know more? CISA has a great document called Best Practices for MITRE ATT&CK Mapping. It's got do's, it's got don'ts, it's got a lot of really good examples and just general guidance that goes into a bit more detail. They've also got a really cool tool called Decider, and it's available on GitHub, and it's got a fancy search, it's got question trees, and it might help you to go through this process a little bit easier. But also, if you can't map a technique, it might be new. There might be some ambiguity there that is fixable. Please let us know. Tell us, talk to us. We want your feedback. If you're still confused, maybe we can make things easier. And also, as you go through this conference over the next 2 days, I encourage you to think about, as everyone's giving their awesome talks and talking about these new techniques they've discovered, for example, where would you map them? What tactics and techniques would they fall under? Are they new? Maybe they don't fit at all. So that's something to think about too, and just kind of get some practice in that way of interacting with attack. So I guess I'm around for the next 2 days. We also have an email, but if you have questions, I'll also take them now.
All right, we'll take some questions from folks. I do have one question in the Slack for you. What's the best way to contribute to improve cloud-specific attack techniques, including opportunities like working groups?
Yeah, I mean, email us, I guess. Like, we really do monitor the inbox carefully. We try to get back to people as fast as possible. We always want contributions, so just starting there is a great spot. And we'll see how we can work together. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience in the room? I do have a question. In terms of starting point, when you're in a hybrid environment, do you recommend to start, and when I say hybrid, you have an on-prem and cloud. Would you recommend starting with the attack techniques for your on-prem or for your cloud environment first?
Yeah, I think that one of the really interesting spots is kind of where we're thinking between on-prem and cloud especially, so thinking about things like Active Directory Federation services and ways that adversaries may target on-prem to reach the cloud or cloud to reach the on-prem. And I think that could be an interesting place to start, is look at ways in which they overlap that you might not be thinking about in the same high priority as kind of other resources. So, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions?
I think this will be our last question, as we're at 9:30. Thank you.
Okay, I'll hurry up. So when reaching out to you, I'm working for a vendor, and my problem basically is most of the time, the new technique that I observed, there's no public blog about it. Can it still be added to MITRE? Because I always thought it's not possible then
Yeah, so I guess we need something that's like publicly citable that describes it. But if you have evidence that it's been used in the wild, then tell us, and we don't, like, that is acceptable. So I think, like, as long as there's something kind of publicly to point to, that's really important, and that we know that it's been used. So, yeah.
All right, well, thank you again, Casey. Our next session will start in 8 minutes. Thank you.